Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us for this short panel discussion on workplace conflict, which, as you'll see as we go through, there's probably more to it than meets the eye. I'm Felix Spender, and before we start, let's just introduce the two panelists who are on it, Kay Hamlin and Kim Whalen-Blake. Kay, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Kay Hamlin from 8 Legal. We provide very practical, down-to-earth HR and employment law support for small and medium-sized businesses, and also provide workplace mediation to help people resolve these conflicts and rebuild the relationships in the workplace. Thanks, Felix.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Kim. I'm an employment solicitor at Hughes Paddison Solicitors. We're a small medium firm based in Cheltenham. Pretty much a full service offering other than crime. So if you get into trouble with the police, then we're definitely not the people to assist you with that, but pretty much cover everything else. I do solely employment law. And so I guess my part of this discussion really is to give you the encouragement to try and resolve these issues, because when it hits my side of the fence, it's definitely gets far more challenging and far more costly in respect of finances and time. So thank you for having me. Hopefully you'll find the discussion interesting, but if not, then we will try and inject some humour to make up for that.
Okay. Before we start, let me just say this: we're a small group on here today, so that's brilliant, and that gives us the opportunity to have quite a lot of participation if you feel you want to join in. So if you've got a question or you want to contribute to the discussion from your own experience, use the hands up sign or attract our attention, or put a question on the chat net and we'll bring you into the conversation, because I think the more people engaged in this, the better. So then let's start off on this, and I'm going to start off with a raft of statistics, actually, because there are some startling statistics out there concerning workplace conflict. ACAS estimates that workplace conflict costs the UK around 28.5 billion a year, or £1,000 per employee. The Chartered Institute of Personal Development showed that 25% of productivity is lost by individuals involved in conflict, and of course there's usually more than one person involved in a conflict. Unresolved conflict is the decisive factor in 50% of employment departures, and 65% of employment problems stem from strained relationships between employees. So, given the high cost of workplace conflict, why do businesses and organisations let it occur? Kay, let's get you to kick this one off, please.
I think there's a huge amount of avoidance. Most people are quite averse to conflict, and a lot of managers aren't terribly well equipped to deal with it. So small things happen and they just ignore it. And those small things generally don't go away on their own. And they tend to get bigger and become bigger problems. And I think, poor communication can be a factor in that. And a lot of conflict, actually, it comes down to hurt feelings. So somebody perceives some slight or injustice. Or the other one that we see sometimes, and I'm sure Kim sees this as well, is sometimes you get sort of accusations of things like bullying or harassment, almost as a smokescreen for somebody who knows they're not doing their job terribly well. And so when the manager's trying to manage them, they can push back and say, oh, you're bullying me, you're harassing me. So there can be a whole raft of things. But I think at root, a lot of it comes down to a bit of fear, hurt feelings, perceived injustice, and then it just spirals from there.
Yeah, interesting. Kim, can you pad that out a bit with maybe some of your own experiences?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely do see that quite a lot of the time. It is a bit of the ostrich effect, and quite often when I see things, it's like, oh, why has somebody just not nipped this in the bud right early on? Because it's got all this way down this process. And the longer it goes, the harder it is then, or the more effort is needed to mend those bridges. I also see it quite a lot in organisations where either people have been promoted up the ranks very quickly. See it quite a lot in the legal world where, we're trained to do a specialist job, and then as you go up the hierarchy, you're then all of a sudden expected to be a manager. and magically have those skills, and a lot of those individuals may not be equipped to deal with workplace conflict, or could quite often be, sometimes because they're used to doing things their own way, be the cause of the workplace conflict. And so those seem to be the quite often the nub of the issues. But as Kay said, a lot of it is perspective, and we generally see things very much from our own perspectives, and those little things, particularly the more experienced we get, and the more business matters that we're dealing with, and the wider picture views, we can often sometimes forget actually what seems to be a trivial thing to us is actually a really important or big deal for somebody else. And so a lot of the time it's just having that stop to say, actually, if they're upset about this, then it must be something that's important to them. And just because I can't see that it's important to me because I've got 700 things else that I'm juggling, doesn't mean that, I should just brush that under the carpet. And if I could just take a step back and acknowledge that, then it might help progress things going forward.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think the three things that came to mind were the promotion of specialists without the right sort of development, maybe, the different perceptions, and this failure to nip things in the bud because maybe we don't see it as important. I mean, what's interesting is that over the years, we've seen numerous cases of workplace conflict that have hit headlines, and the one I'm thinking about at the moment is the tomato throwing event in the Houses of Commons and this sort of thing that's been going on. And once we are left with a sense of disbelief that the matter was not nipped in the bud earlier for the reasons that you've mentioned. But let's try and help managers a bit now. So when should or when must managers intervene? And Kim, let's come at this from your point of view to start off with. When should they, when must they?
Yeah. Well, obviously, legally speaking, there are some very clear red flags of when it definitely needs to be tackled. And if you've got anything that's being suggested that falls within basically any of our protected characteristics, the Equality Act, or any of the whistleblowing stuff, so those things you need to be very alert to, because they're going that one step further in respect of what's being said. So just to take the room in case you're not sure what I'm saying when I'm using all of that legal speak, your Equality Act stuff is I'm being discriminated against because I've got a disability, or my sex, or my sexual orientation, those sorts of things. So if anything's coming to light that relates to one of those key characteristics, you really need to get your ears standing on an end and go, right, I definitely need to deal with this, because to ignore it is definitely going to lead to a bigger problem. And when I talk about whistleblowing, those are the things that, somebody's committing a criminal offence, or breaching a legal obligation, or putting somebody's health and safety in danger. Those individuals that are raising concerns like that get a whole hope of extra legal protections. So if any of those things come across your radar, definitely do not stick your head in the sand with it. Although that said, like I said, any little grumbles, because like I said, in my experience, I would say probably at least half, if not more, of the things that come across my desk have started with just little grumbles of, oh, somebody's used my mug, or somebody keeps using my, or somebody keeps leaving the door open, or they keep opening the windows, little niggly things like that. It never ceases to amaze me how we start with something that it seems so tiny, then the resentment builds, and then it's a bit more, and then they looked at me funny, then they've asked me to do this job which is not part of my job, then they've criticized me for this, and it very quickly escalates.
Yeah.
I mean, Kay, what's interesting is that there's a sort of threshold there. It sounds to me that there's a threshold, and it's judging that. And at what point should managers just leave people to sort it out? And at what point should they say, actually, this is enough? Where does the threshold sit?
It's a really tricky line, isn't it? Because you don't want to be jumping in every time somebody has the tiniest petty little disagreement. I mean, obviously, Kim's outlined the red lines. I think if you're aware of it, then you probably should be at least monitoring the situation, or making sure that something is happening about it, rather than just leaving them to it. If it's something that if it's big enough for you to notice it, then it's probably big enough for you to, at the very least, monitor what's happening. And I think so often the idea that they should, from the outside, as Kim said, it might look trivial, and you think, well, of course, they're adults, they can deal with that, but it's not necessarily trivial to them. And I think, as Kim has said, left, then these things tend to escalate. And once you find somebody annoying, everything they do is annoying. So something that somebody else would do and you wouldn't even notice, if it's them, it's like, oh, she's always like that, she's always doing that's just typical of her, and it just builds and builds and builds. So I'm definitely one for saying sooner rather than later, even if that's in a very informal way, just a quiet word, what's going on here, what can I do to help? And it doesn't have to be a formal intervention or anything sort of major, but even at the early stage when it seems quite trivial, just kind of step in and have a quiet word and just see if there's something that can be done to smooth it over and just improve that communication between the two people, I think.
Yeah, I'd also say, obviously be aware of your audience, if you know your workplace. So for instance, I've seen things, I've just very literally this very week, I've had somebody come in where it's a young female that's come into the office because of comments that have been made to her by a far more senior and older male manager. And so, if you're mindful of actually your cohort and what they may feel more sensitive to, that is obviously also giving you a heads up on that. So, if you've got younger females in the office and you also then have older people that may be kind of more familiar with working with one another, knowing each other's skills, knowing where their boundaries are, the whole bantery thing. See it quite a lot with football staff and things like that. It's just being mindful that actually their sports chatter may actually be then or seem more intimidatory to newer people that are coming into the office, younger people that are coming into the office, particularly young females in the current environment that we are in, where it's all splashed all over the news. So understanding your cohort, I think, is a good place to start as well.
Yeah, really important point, actually. Yeah.
I think that's a really good idea, and I, understanding your audience is one of these points we make now that we live in a generational, multi-diverse workspace. What's means one thing to one generation means something different to another generation, and I think the point about putting a sort of not a warning shot, but just a point that drawing someone's attention to something early is very valid, actually. Let's move on. And the whole question of the threshold, where does the threshold sit? We all know what the really bad stuff is, and then there's a threshold somewhere which will differ. And that's a whole different, whole longer conversation going on there, which we haven't got time to cover. So let's look at practical things now. What can managers do to resolve or manage conflict? And Kay, why don't you start this one off?
I mean, I think the first thing is, as I say, to be aware. So actually, as a manager, you should have your ear to the ground. You should be spending time talking to people, asking them not just everything okay, yeah, fine, and walking on, but actually asking open questions and listening to people. So I think the first thing is an awareness of the situation. And then again, I think if it is something more potentially serious, as Kim's outlined, sort of potential discrimination or harassment or anything like that that's going on, then you've got to step on it very, very quickly and quite probably start a formal process of some sort, unless it is clearly amenable to something else. Other than that, I think it is just listening, having a conversation, bringing people together, trying to understand both points of view. I mean, in effect, acting in a very informal way, in the way that a mediator would, as in just non-judgmental, not jumping to conclusions, listening to both sides and just seeing if you can find common ground and help them to understand each other a bit better. Because it's generally just a mismatch of perceptions about a situation that then escalates into something more serious. So if you can hear both sides and then bring those two people together, that's what you do in a formal mediation effectively, but there's no reason why a manager can't implement some of those techniques at a very, very early stage and try and prevent things from escalating.
Yeah, I'd say on a practical level, and I think, you know, when we were discussing this topic, I think we touched upon this as well, is that we'll all be in situations, because obviously managers are human as well at the end of the day. Business owners, we're human at the end of the day too. And so there will be some things that will also invoke a reaction in yourself, or you will have had your own, it's obviously normal. We all make judgments and preconceptions about people, and we also have our own tolerance levels, and it can be very easy just to project that onto somebody else. Well, this person always moans, or that's not a big deal, why are you moaning about it? And when you have those it's being aware of when you have those emotions in yourself, that actually maybe it's not the right time for you to jump immediately on that, and for you just to take a step back, assess the noise, and then go, right, now I'm going to follow up on that. And it might be that the first follow-up is, I've overheard this conversation, you seem to be a bit upset, do you want to come in and have a chat about it? And you approach it in that way, but at a time in which you've been able to mellow your own initial thoughts about it, so that you're going in with a clear head.
Yeah. It's putting aside those preconceptions that you might have about people or what's going on, or and coming at it from as neutral perspective as you can. That's, you know, because if you start making judgments before you've even really talked to people, then you're not going to be able to help anybody, I don't think.
Yeah, and the same it goes in terms of, you know, we'll all have examples of it where there's somebody in an office where you're like, well, that's just that person. That, you know, you don't need to take offence to that. That's just how they behave, and you almost get to the stage where you just justify their behaviour because that's who they are. It's not allowing actually that to be an acceptable answer. If you know that there's somebody that is always a bit brusque or a bit grumpy and just brushing it off, well, you know, that's Bob, you know, or that's Julie, you know, that's not acceptable either. Those conversations do need to be dealt with, and you do need to be pulling that person to one side and say, not sure you're aware of this, but sometimes when you respond to people, it comes across as a bit more stern, or you know, just flagging it to your attention just in case you're not aware of it, rather than just going, oh, it's okay, because they don't mean anything by it. They're horrible conversations. Nobody likes. I think that's the crux of it, isn't it? None of us like to deal with confrontation or conflict. You know, as a being, we tend to want to avoid it because it makes us feel uncomfortable. But I don't know about you, Kate, and you, Felix, but certainly in my experience, if you ignore it, it rarely goes away, and it usually then comes back, you know, 10 times over.
And I think especially in a fairly small business, it can be a very, you know, very close-knit, almost family atmosphere. And actually trying to intervene in that, it can be very difficult, because everybody has got an opinion, and everybody, you know, will have their view of who's right and who's wrong. And you can end up very quickly with these factions developing within a business as well. I'm
going to, I see Glenn's got his hand up, so I'm going to bring him in because he's been sitting there patiently, and then we'll come back to this question of non-judgmental and impartial conversations, maybe. Glenn. No, you need to turn your microphone on.
You'd be thought after a couple of years we might know how to do this. Having come out of the project management world, where I used to deliver big projects in big organizations, change often doesn't happen without some form of conflict going on. And actually team building doesn't happen without some low level of conflict, because you need to go through that, through the standard forming, norming, storming and all that kind of shenanigans. So one of the things we need to be mindful of is some jobs, and I'm going to look at project managers in particular, they spend the majority of their days having difficult conversations. Why haven't you done what you promised when you were promised it? And also potentially having difficult conversations with various people about, I'm about to deliver some change to you and you don't like my message. So it actually means that quite a lot of the time there are jobs that have a higher that people in them tend to have a higher tolerance level for dealing with conflict, and may say things in a way that they need to say to get things done that are misinterpreted. So one of the things we've got to be really mindful of, and this thresholds idea is a really important one, is some people don't like change, some people don't like being told about change, but unfortunately from the organization's point of view, sometimes those conversations need to be had. And yes, they need to be had sensitively, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, we need some action as a result of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you, Glenn. And, you know, there is a healthy level of conflict. You know, we had that discussion when discussing about this topic, you know, and without a healthy level of conflict, nothing changes, nothing grows, nothing develops. And you don't want to, you know, stop that. I think it's more about trying to get people to be comfortable with having those discussions, and they'll feel comfortable if, I think primarily the key number one skill is listening, isn't it? Hear it time and time again. And equally, you know, I see it all of the time with managers. You know, you can't please everybody, and the business is doing, you know, needs to do its job. It needs to, and there will be occasions when we'll all have bad days and we won't be our best selves. And quite often what I see in my practice is when somebody's raised a grievance or it's got up to that stage, and the managers then obviously take it very personally. When you're in a managerial role or you're in a business leadership role, the chances are it's going to come across your plate at some stage, because you're managing people, and you're going to be sometimes delivering messages that they don't want to hear, particularly in capability processes where somebody's not performing very well. It's very, very common that you're having those discussions and you'll then have some form of formal conflict.
I think what's interesting there is that it's really a healthy conflict at work shouldn't be personal.
Yeah.
But I think as humans, we have a tendency to personalize it. So criticism about what we're doing is felt as criticism of us. That's how we are as human beings. That's how emotionally we tend to be wired. So getting that healthy level of conflict, or that acceptable level of conflict without it becoming personal, is really difficult, really, really challenging. And it comes down to, you know, Pete was talking there about emotional intelligence, which is actually what we're doing as the next topic in this series. And it is about knowing how to manage your own emotions, manage other people's emotions, be aware of how they're feeling, how you know what the effect your words are having on them. So it's having that healthy workplace kind of, you can have disagreements and you can have conflict about change, but it shouldn't be about individual people and judgments about them. And I think that's where it gets really, really difficult, when people start to feel it's a personal attack on them.
So, okay, I'm going to leave the script slightly now.
Is the curveball.
How then, in fairness to everyone else, we've talked about this, how then do we start to have those conversations? How do we shape our behavior that we have those healthy conversations? Because I understand what you mean, but for other people, how do we do it?
Well, for me, it's finding the right time. I think, as Kim has already said, being aware of your own prejudgments and your own emotional state. So choosing a time when you are in control of how you're feeling. Being very, it's the standard one, isn't it, with any feedback, that you criticize the action rather than the person, but being very careful about how one words things when you're talking to somebody, and then really most important of all, asking really open questions and really listening to the answers and really trying to get underneath what's driving that behavior. It's sometimes the concern that somebody comes to you with, so that it's not fair, such and such is always doing so and so. It's not really about this one thing that they've done. It's about the underlying perception, and maybe it might be this person's need for recognition and reward, and they feel they're not being recognized and somebody else is. But they're not going to come along and say, oh, it's not fair, you don't ever tell me how great I am. They're going to come along with some position that kind of justifies how they're feeling. So that kind of open, non-judgmental listening, you've got to try and tease out what that underlying need is in somebody, almost, that's driving the discontent in the first place. I don't know if that made sense at all, but
no, it's open, non-judgmental listening. I mean, that's almost the sort of key to it, really, isn't it? Yeah. An impartial approach. Let me just, what I want to go is come back to Kim, because Kay's just given us a bit of a sort of insight into how you might deal with it. But if we were to go down the formal route for dealing with conflict, how does that work? I mean, in your experience, how does it work? How easy is it for businesses to do? Does it resolve anything?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in the first instance, I'd say it is easy to do and it should be done. And generally speaking, it lands on my desk, or it gets more difficult because the businesses are just about too scared to do it, rather than actually just cracking on and doing it. I mean, in the first instance, I always say informal is the better approach. So if you can catch it, that's why I always say catch it early enough, nip it in the bud. Those types of discussions are definitely the best way. Because that's before people have become more entrenched and there's more resentment and things that have been built up. Obviously, if that's not been possible and it has to go down through a more formal route, and I don't necessarily mean, you know, it being grievances and things like that, but obviously if a grievance has been raised, you literally do have a legal obligation to investigate that. And if you don't, then you will, you know, it goes further in a court process, you will be penalised for it in basically an uplift of compensation. And that uplift can be 25% for you not dealing with those things. So it can be significant. But in a more formal route, as I say, a more formal route is, an informal route is you're hearing something seems to be getting a bit heated, or somebody's said something in that moment that, you know, you think is actually not workplace appropriate. It's about dealing with it there and then, in the sense of, I've just overheard that. That's not really the behaviour we expect here. Maybe take a few minutes to think about that, want to see an improvement with it, and you may want to think about whether you apologise to the individual because I've overheard it and I thought that was a bit abrupt. Those types of things, because they've happened there and then. In those moments, the last thing the person needs you doing is raising it a month later when it's passed. But on a other more informal level is if you've noticed a few things, or somebody's, you know, like I said, somebody's coming in late or being tardy or hanging around the water cooler too much, those types of things. I always say, you know, you pick your moment because you need to be able to listen. They might be unfocused or hanging around things because they do have issues that are bugging them and they don't know how to bring it to your attention, whether that's because they don't feel comfortable in doing it themselves, or whether it's because you're busy. You know, there are all sorts of reasons as to why somebody hasn't raised it sooner. It is about having time in your diary, because let's face it, we're all busy. Work keeps us busy. We can fill it every hour of every day. I'm going to actually put some time aside to deal with that, and then pick that time, invite them to do it, and pick the right location to do it. So whether it's in your office, so it's away from people, whether it's, shall we go and take a walk to go and get a coffee, you know, and it's more, informal that way. There are very practical ways to do that. And my absolute number one recommendation is put the listening ears on. Don't try and solve it in the moment. You don't have to solve it in the moment. You don't have to give any really feedback in it. You can just say, just want to listen to what you've got to say, and I'll take that away. And that usually is then far better, because where I'm dealing with cases where it's employees that have complained about things, the biggest thing that I hear time and time again is I've never felt that I've been heard. I've always felt that I've presented something and it's been squashed straight down. There's always a reason for it, or there's always a solution for it, but nobody's actually listening. So just by not putting your solution focused head on, which is really hard when you're a manager or a business owner, and just putting the listening ears on, that goes probably 90% of the way to solving the problem in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, can I just stick with that for a minute, because what you've said is absolute gold dust there, I think, to people. Earlier you said, if there is a grievance raised, you have the legal obligation to investigate it. So the grievance comes and that's it. But from what you've said, that before a grievance is raised, there's probably a sort of a period of building up to the threshold for people to do it.
Yeah.
And would you like to sort of try and put a figure on how long it takes for that to build up? Is it instantaneous?
I mean, it's difficult, and it very much will depend on the individual. So we will all know people that will be very quick to raise grievances. You know, if you've been in business for any period of time, you know, there are a small minority of individuals that will always raise complaints. We call them in our world career litigants, because they're also the same people that bring claim after claim, but they are very much in the minority. Where you've got actually, when it's got to a formal grievance, you for sure have missed a whole load of queues that have happened before it. Generally, employees do not want to raise grievances because there is still the perception there of, once I've raised a grievance, that's it, you know, my cards are going to be marked, you know, I'm going to be considered to be a troublemaker or a hassle and things like that. They don't typically raise grievances willy-nilly. They are raising a grievance, whether rightly or wrongly, they perceive something bad has happened. So you will have had probably a good few weeks, if not months, of things that have built up to them actually going, no, I'm done now. I'm raising it formally.
That's interesting. Kay, you've been sitting quietly on the sidelines. Come in and add your...
No, well, I totally agree with what Kim said. And I think the other thing that happens, of course, is that some of these people, and they could be really valuable people, they won't even get to the stage of raising a grievance, they'll just leave.
Yeah.
And then you've got that turnover, and, you know, recruitment is expensive, and in a lot of industries at the moment, really difficult. So by not having your listening ears on, by not being open to these conversations early on, yes, you get the formal grievances and things like that. Other than that, people will just go. You'll just lose them. So it's just so important, you know, that having your ear to the ground, being approachable, having the right conversations, and really listening can prevent so much.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, I've seen that, Kay. I don't know whether you have as well, like gone into businesses and dealing with an issue, and they've had multiple like exit interviews where the same people have complained about the same things, and they still haven't addressed it. And where that also happens, I also see in my ward, and it does make it very difficult, where you've allowed somebody's behaviour to continue over an extended period of time, then somebody then tries addressing it. That in itself then becomes a really difficult, because they're like, well, it's never bothered you before, so why is it now bothering you now? Oh, you're just picking on me, or I've fallen out of favour, or I've got a new manager in and they just don't like me. And you tend to get issues from that as well. It
becomes, people think it's personal then, don't they? It's always been okay before. I've got this new manager and suddenly it's a problem. Therefore, the problem actually is with the manager rather than the thing. And I think the other thing I would say is that when you get onto formal disciplinaries and grievances, certainly formal disciplinaries, it's almost it's a lost cause. It's almost impossible to bring people back on board in a positive way, I think, once you get to that sort of end point. So I think it is all about prevention, and listening is at the heart of that. Yeah.
I'm just going to pick up on Viv's comment that there's a lot to be said for living your company values day to day, and I agree. And I would say that in my experience, companies create a values list, which is largely, in a lot of cases, meaningless because it's something to pin on the wall. But if you have the right set of values, of course, you could have a set of values, live it day to day, and it'd be a nightmare. But if you have the right set of values and live it day to day, then I think a lot of this goes away. You know, there's some very interesting stuff going on there at the moment.
And I think, well, yeah, particularly if you've got your values and then actually the behaviour on the ground is completely different, that just creates discord and discontent, and you're setting yourself up for problems, aren't you?
And it's usually the first thing that's thrown up in an employment tribunal claim. They say this, they do the opposite, and it's not good for your reputation, because obviously if it's got to that stage and it's landed with me, all of those judgments are public. You know, you can search, they're on direct.gov. You spend all of your time creating all of this lovely reputation, and it can then very easily come tumbling down.
Yeah, no, very, very, very valid point. We've got some time left, so I want to change. I mean, I think we've sort of talked about it, and the three things, you know, that to me have stood out from this are thresholds. Everyone has a different threshold, and how you manage that and understand that. The importance of listening, which has come across loud and clear, no pun intended. And time, make time to deal with the problem. And I think making time is sometimes part of the issue, because we don't think it's important, and therefore we don't bother to make time. And actually what we do is we end up expending more time. But Can I just now try and put this, which maybe touch on the values piece, I mean, we know this goes on. What more could we as leaders or as individuals or as organizations do to really reduce this to a manageable level? I mean, this is the $28.5 billion question, isn't it?
We've got a golden egg. I think, practically, I mean, this and this very much depends on the size of the business and things like that as well. But obviously, where you're appointing managers and things like that, are you really appointing the best person to be a manager? Because not all of us are going to be good at that, and we do live in a society where traditionally the hierarchy comes with management rather than the focus being on, technical and managerial, and they're both equal and they're both important, but just you can't do both all of the time. Well, it's very rare for somebody to be able to be good at both any of the time. So if you've got obviously the capacity to be able to do that, great. And obviously any sort of management training schemes, because like I said, a lot of it comes down to, giving them the skills or creating the skills to do that. If you're in a smaller business where you're the business owner and you're the manager and all, it's far more harder in that sense. A lot of that is, right, well, okay, this is my business. This is my, what I'm going to be using to pay my mortgages and things like that. It's important it's done well. And therefore I need to invest the time in terms of I'm not going to have this business without the support of the people on the ground doing the work. I need to work on these skills myself, and it's having the appetite to do that, because it's not easy. Being a manager isn't easy. You're dealing with people, and unlike products and processes and things like that, which are controllable, people obviously have a total mind of their own, and they come with all of their own stuff. And so, you only need to have maybe 3 or 4 people in the mix, and you've got a very different, diverse group of people that you're trying to adapt your style to. So I would say it's the self-awareness piece, isn't it?
And it's about placing a value on those kind of soft skills. So and realizing that actually not everybody is great at it straight off, and people do need help and support in developing those skills. Like you say, if you've been a technical expert in whatever you're doing, and then suddenly you're a manager, you don't suddenly have those skills. So I think it's, seeing the value in it, actually helping people, putting in place support, mentoring, training, whatever that is. And also modeling it from the top. So there's no point in expecting your managers to be these really great listeners and people who deal with this stuff if you're at the top and you're ignoring it. So I think it's got to be sort of top down, and that communication has got to be, but it's got to be two-way. So I think a lot of it is just about accepting, recognizing the value in those skills, and therefore making sure that you prioritize them.
Yeah, it's got to be in the culture, I think.
It has, yeah.
And the culture is, as Glenn keeps telling me, is all encompassing, and it's the leadership and how you go about business and deal with your customers and the whole lot. It's got to be in the culture.
Healthy challenge is acceptable, but you're treating people with respect. I mean, I can certainly say from our organisation, so we have, I think there's 12 directors now for our business, and there is 60, 65 staff. And every single one of us around the directors table couldn't be different from one another. We are a right mixed bunch. I say, don't tell my bosses this, but I say that we're like the raggy dolls of the legal profession. And you're just like sitting there going, we're all just mishmash. And on paper, you're like, how on earth does this ever work? Because you couldn't get 12 more different people around the room. And the only thing in which I can say why it works is because we have that listening and mutual respect. So I absolutely, hands up, don't get some of the ideas that my directors come across the table with or how they want to deal with things. But, I'm respectful in listening to it, taking a step back, putting my view across, they listen to it. And that's where it comes from. So you can do it with all of the different perspectives and different personalities, but for it to work, you fundamentally need to have that listening and respect.
Yeah. Brilliant. I'm conscious that we're getting to the end of our time. Is there any I've got one final question to you, but before I ask that, is there any questions from the floor maybe that you'd like to throw in at this stage?
Or if you want to share your own experiences, obviously I'm sure it's a Clapton house rules in these forums and groups, you know, so if you're not comfortable with something sharing, then obviously don't, but you know, if you've got any scenarios that you've come across that you want to share.
This is going to be posted online, so
okay.
Well, I'm happy to share. We have an open door policy. We have a workplace forum where people bring issues, and it's very much from the top, as you say before. Totally agree with that. I think when you spoke about management before, which is why I put listening, empathy, is leadership behaviours and not management control. So it's that difference that people have that business head, but the soft side of things isn't necessarily taught. It sometimes comes from within, but it can be developed, I guess, over time. Don't know what anybody else thinks on that, but definitely my thoughts.
It can definitely be developed, can't it? I mean, some people are more innately tuned into that side of themselves and other people, but you can definitely help people to develop those skills.
Yeah, and what I found is just because you're really good at something, maybe a good store assistant is generally promoted to a supervisor, but they might not make a good supervisor.
Yep.
They might be just really good at what they do, and therefore a good steady Eddie for the future, and might not want to be a manager or might not succeed in that position. And that's what a lot of businesses are guilty of, promoting people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Viv. And I see that all of the time. And really tragically, what I often see in those scenarios is you'll have somebody that has had a really long service with the business, doing very well in that job. And then they know full well they're not going to be necessarily suited to that promotion. But because they've been such a valued employee and doing very well at that job, they're like, well, we need to recognise that. And the only way in which they recognise it is by giving a promotion. But it's to a promotion of a job, one that they're not really wanting in the sense of what the job is, other than the fact it's a promotion and maybe comes with more money. And they're almost going to be destined to fail at it, because whilst these skills can be learnt or honed in on, there are also some individuals that they don't want to do it, or they're not able to do it. But that doesn't mean the skills that they've got are any less valued, and it's recognising that it's okay to have technical people and value that without having to promote them up the management or leadership chain.
Agreed. I'm in a chemical manufacturing plant, by the way. That's my environment.
Yeah, so you must have huge technical capabilities.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
I would just add to that that you can promote people up on the basis that we think, but you do need to prepare them for it, and we consistently fail to invest in any leadership development training, all these little personal skills that we're talking about, and we just assume people will know what to do.
Well, they've done really well before, so why on earth wouldn't they do well in this role?
Or, you know, they might even put them through a half-day workshop, and that's suddenly turn them from being somebody on the shop floor to being this great leader. And they don't recognise that it's an ongoing process. You can't just suddenly right, go, and today you're going to learn how to be a leader. Off you go, and then come back and you can do it. It just doesn't work like that. But that's,
and also having that support there when the difficult stuff does arise. So, you know, you will see people that start on their management journey and it's all going swimmingly when everything is working really nicely and everybody's meeting their goals and it's all great and it's all hunky-dory. And then you'll have either a grievance raised or somebody on long-term sick or something gets a bit more challenging. Then there's no support to help them through their first tricky bit, and then that knocks their confidence. So
we're starting now to drift into the world of leadership and mentoring, which is another fascinating subject, but we'll bring it back on. But thanks for Viv for raising that, and
thanks
for the comments that have been going in there. Right, before we go, one last final bit. What advice, this actually touches on what we've just been talking about, what advice would you give to young managers who are assuming their first managerial position? So exactly as Viv's been well, almost exactly as Viv's been describing.
I mean, it's a huge question, really. I think don't be too hard on yourself. Actually recognize yourself that that it's a learning curve. So I think a lot of people can beat themselves up a lot. Depending on the organization, if there is a manager that you respect and trust, then try and engage them as a mentor and get them to help you with that journey. And then communication, listening, more listening, and not ignoring stuff. That's sort of in a nutshell all I can come up with, but it's a huge question.
Yeah, I was trying to think back to when did I start as a baby manager? And it's like, no, I'm too old. I can't remember that far back. But I think everything that you said there, Kay, is very valid, and I think it's also not being afraid to ask for help. So, when you're coming across something that you're finding a bit more tricky because you haven't dealt with it before, it's new. And when we're doing our like technical stuff, so I can only obviously speak from my experience, but if I've had a new case that's on an area of law that I hadn't actually, other than in theory, run a practical thing on, to have no issue going, I haven't done this before, and bounce ideas off. Then you come along a management issue where somebody, I'll give you a very clear example. When I must have only been a manager for maybe about 6 months, and we had an individual in the team that had a body odour issue. Now, I can tell you as a manager, one of the most difficult things to deal with is somebody that has personal hygiene issues, because obviously it's a very sensitive topic. But I was getting loads of complaints, not only from people from the team, but from people that visited our floor, and nobody had ever wanted to deal with it because it was so sensitive. And I was just like, oh my God, how do I deal with this? I really like this person. It's a really horrible thing. I can't go up to her and go, you smell, wash, that's just like totally inappropriate. And so I went and asked, I asked around other managers. I've asked, if other people had dealt with it. I spoke about it, in my friendship circle. And so before I approached the issue, I just did a recce and go, Joe, I've not dealt with this before. It's complicated. And I think don't be afraid to ask for help. And if you're in a small business where there isn't people that you can go and ask for help in the business, this is why you've got this community. There's loads of people in this community. Pick up the phone, contact somebody, go, oh my God, I've got to deal with this, and I'm sure you'll probably get a million people helping, offering you their tidbits of advice.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice. Mentoring, ask for help. I mean, they're invaluable. The one piece of advice two pieces of advice I'd give to them is, first of all, understand that conflict is going to be part of your life until the very moment you die. It's always going to be there in some shape or form, because that's just the way we are. And as a result of that, you need to just spend a little time learning how to deal with it. And once you learn how to deal with it, then you've got a nice piece of gold dust that you can use throughout your life.
Yeah, not just in work.
Yeah.
No,
everywhere.
Maybe start with when you're making a complaint about something. We'll all have that, so my mum won't make a complaint in a restaurant at all, even if her food is really terrible. And there is there is a good way in which you can raise complaints without looking like a complete, I was going to swear then, but I won't because it's recorded, but you can fill in the blank, and maybe starting with those little uncomfortable things, and then just keep building on it.
Yeah.
I think we should draw it to a close there. Kay and Kim, thank you for the contribution. Been brilliant. I wish we could have extended this for another 2 hours and kept the conversation going. Thank you to all the panelists everyone who participated for your comments and insightful thoughts. And I think unless anyone's got anything further to say, that's it.
Just one last point, as I say, the next one of these sessions is the 22nd of December, so it's very close to Christmas. But I'll be talking to Vicky Henderson about emotionally intelligent business. So kind of relates very much to some of what we've been talking about today, I think, and some of those skills that we've been talking about.
Bring your mulled wine and your mince pies.
Absolutely. Christmas hat's optional, but I should probably be wearing some antlers or something, I think.
Okay.